Hello and welcome. I am Shivangi Anand and subject expert of this lecture is Mr. Kumar Barun. To comprehend the basic nuances of composition and to understand the various elements involved in composing. In its simplest definition, composition is a combination or arrangement of elements. A photographic composition is the arrangement of visual elements and as such is the product of a photographer's vision and their skill in seeing, identifying, arranging and framing the finished image. This quality of work is clearly a distinct skill from those necessary to successfully operate a camera or calculate exposure. In general, good pictures are a result of paying attention to the most intricate details and meticulously arranging basic elements of composition together. Appropriate lighting and an interesting subject further accentuate a photograph. Three photographers shooting the same scene may create equally appealing yet different photographs, comprehending three different types of composition. We shall now take a look at the elements which help complete a photograph in terms of its feel, objective and presentation. To begin with, we will elaborate on the photographer has to begin with identifying the primary point of interest before taking the picture. When you have determined which area is the most important for the photographer to use in the picture, he or she can compose the same to emphasize the significant subject. A good way of getting acquainted with point of interest is by studying advertisements which clearly lay out the element of most important subject prominently. One has to be sure that the viewer gets to see exactly what the photographer wants and intends. If at all there are numerous objects cluttered in the background or the foreground, the message or context of a photograph is lost. If you can't find an angle of framing your subject wherein you can isolate your subject, consider using depth of field to control and keep the background out of focus. A light subject will have more impact if and when placed against a dark background and vice versa. To make a photograph effective, attractive and impactful, a photographer should ideally use contrasting colors in a photograph. For example, the chroma could be blue while the dress of the model could be yellow. Both colors would complement each other at the same time, give a pleasing look to the photograph. Yet, using contrasting colors could at times lead to distraction, therefore selection of appropriate colors in right proportion is a must. Balance gives meaning and feel to a picture. Commonly, balance is of two types, namely formal balance and informal balance. Formal balance leads to symmetrical or proportionate design, done with the sense of seriousness and sophistication. A clear example of the same could be witnessed in advertisements framed for tender notices, announcements or classifieds. Informal balance is pleasing by being unpredictable, experimental and interesting at the same time. The best example of informal balance resides in nature, where on one side are mountains, at the same time there is a river, forest, animals and birds that give beauty to a natural scene. Generally, a symmetrical or informal balance is considered to be pleasing for a photograph as compared to a symmetrical or formal balance. In other words, placing the subject off center and balancing the weight with other objects in the picture, whether smaller or with little importance, will prove to be extremely effective than placing the main subject in the center of the picture. Lines can have a very nice impact on your composition, making it more appealing. They can grab the attention of the eye into a certain direction, they can add depth to the photo, and they can form interesting patterns. Lines can be found all around us. The horizon, beaches and fallen trees all can add interesting horizontal lines to your photos, which can add a sense of stability to the picture. While adding lines to your composition, you should not forget about the rule of thirds and try to keep the horizontal lines perpendicular to the edges of your photo. Remember that this type of lines is usually more convenient to horizontal photos. Vertical lines are even more obvious to us. Think of buildings, upright trees and light posts. They usually reflect growth and strength, and when used correctly, they can provide interesting patterns, especially when the photograph contains other elements. To avoid misusing the vertical lines, make sure that they are perpendicular to the top and bottom edges of the photo. These lines look best in portrait orientation. Another type of line is the diagonal lines. They can add depth to a photograph as well as creating points of interest inside your composition, and if repeated, they can also produce nice patterns. They also give a feeling of dynamic action. A compositional convention is to avoid placing diagonal lines on the diagonal of the photograph, as the photo will look split. There are truly an endless variety of shapes and combination of shapes, each communicating its own meaning and message. Often the meaning behind shapes is cultural, a red octagon as a stop sign, particularly as shapes are combined. We will confine ourselves to a discussion of some basic geometric shapes here, and I'll provide some links to more detailed sources of shape meaning beyond the basics. Circles have no beginning or end. They represent the eternal whole, and in every culture is an archetypical form representing the sun, the earth, the moon, the universe and other celestial objects between. Circles are used to suggest familiar objects such as wheels, balls, many kinds of fruit. They suggested well-roundedness and completeness. Circles have free movement. They can roll. Shading and lines can enhance this sense of movement in circles. Circles are graceful and their curves are seen as feminine. They are warm, comforting and give a sense of sensuality and love. Their movement suggests energy and power. Their completeness suggests the infinite, unity and harmony. Circles protect, they endure, they restrict, they confine what's within and keep things out. They offer safety and connection. Circles suggest community, integrity and perfection. Because they are less common in design, they work well to attract attention, provide emphasis and set things apart. Squares and rectangles are stable. They are familiar and trusted shapes and suggest honesty. They have right angles and represent order, mathematics, rationality and formality. They are seen as earth-bound. Rectangles are the most common geometric shapes encountered. The majority of text we read is set in rectangles or squares. Squares in rectangles suggest conformity, peacefulness, solidity, security and equality. Their familiarity and stability along with their commonness can seem boring. They are generally not attention getters, but can be tilted to add an unexpected twist. Think of web pages that tilts frame images to help them stand out. In Buddhist symbolism, a square, earthbound inside a circle, the eternal whole, represents the relationship between the human and the divine. Triangles can be stable when sitting on their base or unstable when not. They represent dynamic tension, action and aggression. Triangles have energy and power, and their stable, unstable dynamic can suggest either conflict or steady strength. They are balanced and can be a symbol for law, science and religion. Triangles can direct movement based which way they point. They can be used to suggest familiar themes like pyramids, arrows and pennants. Spiritually, they represent the religious trinity. They can suggest self-discovery and revelation. The strength of triangles suggests masculinity. Their dynamic nature makes them better suited to a growing high-tech company than a stable financial institution when designing a logo. Triangles can be used to convey progression, direction and purpose. Spirals are expressions of creativity. They are often found in the natural growth pattern of many organisms and suggest the process of growth and evolution. Spirals convey idea of fertility, birth, death, expansion and transformation. There are cycles of time, life and the seasons and are a common shape in religious and mystical symbolism. Spirals move in either direction and represent returning to the same point on life's journey with new levels of understanding. They represent trust during change, the release of energy and maintaining flexibility through transformation. Clockwise spirals represent projection of an intention and counterclockwise spirals the fulfillment of an intention. Double spirals can be used to symbolize opposite forces. Crosses symbolize spirituality and healing. They are seen as the meeting place of divine energies. The 4 points of a cross represent self, nature, wisdom and higher power of being. Crosses suggest transition, balance, faith, unity, temperance, hope and life. They represent relationships and synthesis and the need for connection to something, whether that something is group, individual, self or project related. as with lines, vertical shapes are seen as strong and horizontal shapes are seen as peaceful. Most everything said about vertical and horizontal lines can be said about vertical and horizontal shapes. Curved shapes offer rhythm and movement, happiness, pleasure and generosity. They are seen as more feminine than sharp shapes which offer energy, violence and anger. Sharp shapes are lively and youthful and are seen as more masculine. A frame in a photograph is referred to as the foreground, which leads you into the picture or gives you a sense of the viewer's perspective. For example, while taking the picture of a branch with some leaves, framing a shot of moving hills and a valley, or the edge of an imposing rock face leading into a shot of a canyon depicts varied moods and gives out different message to everyone and anyone who looks at the same. Framing can usually improve a picture and provide elegance to it at the same time. Frame doesn't need to be sharply focused. In fact, at times extremely well detailed frames could be distracting rather than being attractive or appealing. The position of the viewer can strongly influence the aesthetics of an image, even if the subject is entirely imaginary and viewed within the mind's eye. Not only does it influence the elements within the picture, but it also influences the viewer's interpretation of the subject. For example, if a boy is photographed from above, perhaps from the eye level of an adult, he is diminished in stature. A photograph taken at the child's level would treat him as equal, and one taken from below could result in an impression of dominance. Therefore, the photographer is choosing the viewer's positioning. A subject can be rendered more dramatic when it fills the frame. There exists a tendency to perceive things as larger than they actually are, and filling the frame fulfills this psychological mechanism. This can be used to eliminate distractions from the background. In photography, altering the position of the camera can change the image so that the subject has fewer or more distractions with which to compete. This may be achieved by getting closer, moving laterally, tilting or moving the camera vertically. If the subject of a photograph is capable of movement such as an animal or a human, it is rather best to leave space in front of the subject. This technique provides a feeling of movement wherein the subject appears to be moving into rather out of the photograph, which adds a lot of drama to the picture. The rule of thirds is a guideline followed by some visual artists. The objective is to stop the subjects and areas of interest such as the horizon from bisecting the image by placing them near one of the lines that would divide the image into 3 equal columns and rows, ideally near the intersection of those lines. The rule of thirds is thought to be a simplification of the golden mean. The golden mean is a ratio that has been used by visual artists for centuries as an aid to composition. When two things are in the proportion of 1:1.618, approximately 3/8 to 5/8, they are said to be in the golden mean. Dividing the parts of an image according to this proportion helps to create a pleasing, balanced composition. The intersection points on a golden mean grid appear at 3/8 in and 3/8 down or up, rather than at 1/3 in and 1/3 down or up on the grid of thirds. Depth of field is a characteristic of a camera that can be used to enhance the image composition of the photo. Depth of field means the sharp area surrounding the point of focus. The magnitude of the sharp area is affected by several factors, namely distance between the camera and the subject, focal length, aperture. The closer the subject to the camera, the more shallow is the depth of field. The longer the focal length, the more shallow the depth of field. The larger the aperture, the smaller the f number, the more shallow the depth of field. It is, however, important to comprehend how to control depth of field in order to utilize it for image composition. For example, the subject of the photo can be emphasized by isolating it from its surroundings by using a shallow depth of field. Shallow depth of field is usually used in portraits, and whereas large depth of field is used to cover huge areas like landscapes. By using shallow depth of field, the distracting background in a picture could be easily blurred and only the subject appears sharp. Viewers' eyes concentrate first on the sharp areas of the photography, and thereby the subject gets more attention automatically. Usually, it is good for landscape photographs to imply large depth of field, especially if all parts of the image appear to be sharp. There is usually no need to isolate elements by utilizing the depth of fields in a landscape photograph. All around sharp photograph can be achieved by using this technique. Also, a sharp picture demands a small aperture. This invariably means that one has to decrease the shutter speed. Therefore, it is often necessary to use tripod while taking landscape shots. The rule of odds states that by framing the object of interest in an artwork with an even number of surrounding objects, it becomes more comforting to the eye, thus creates a feeling of ease and pleasure. It is based on the assumption that humans tend to find visual images that reflect their own preferences, wishes in life more pleasing and attractive. The rule of odds suggests that an odd number of subjects in an image is more interesting than an even number. Thus, if you have more than one subject in your picture, the suggestion is to choose an arrangement with at least 3 subjects. An even number of subjects produces symmetries in the image, which can appear less natural for a naturalistic, informal composition. An image of a person surrounded or framed by 2 other persons, for instance, where the person in the center is the object of interest in that image or artwork, is more likely to be perceived as friendly and comforting by the viewer than an image of a single person with no significant surroundings. Sometimes you take a shot only to find that the final image lacks impact since the subject blends into a busy background. It is rather interesting to note that while the human eye is excellent at distinguishing between the different elements in a scene, a camera has a tendency to flatten the foreground and background. This can often ruin an otherwise wonderful photography. This problem, however, could be solved at the time of shoot by the use of plain and unobtrusive background. The picture could be composed well without adding any distractions to the photograph. When we look at a photo, our eye is naturally drawn along lines. By thinking about how one is able to place lines in a photograph, one can affect the way the viewer would view the image, pulling the viewer into the picture, towards the subject, or on a journey through a scene. There are many different types of lines: curvy, zigzag, straight, radical, diagonal, etc. and each can be used to enhance the photo composition. Rule of space applies to artwork, photography, advertising, illustration, picturing objects to which the artist wants to apply the illusion of movement, or which is supposed to create a contextual bubble in the viewer's mind. This can be achieved, for instance, by leaving space in the direction the eyes of a portrait person are looking, or when picturing a runner, adding white space in front of him rather than behind him to indicate movement. At times, a photo lacks impact implied because the main subject is so small that it gets lost among the clutter of its background or surroundings. By cropping tight around the subject, a photographer can eliminate background noise by ensuring the subject gets the viewer's undivided attention. Other techniques. There should be a center of interest or focus in the work to prevent it becoming a pattern in itself. The direction followed by the viewer's eye should lead the viewer's gaze around all elements in the work before leading out of the picture. The subject should not be facing out of the image. A moving subject should have space in front. Exact bisections of the picture space should be avoided. Small, high contrast elements have as much impact as larger, duller elements. The prominent subject should be off center unless a symmetrical or formal composition is desired and can be balanced by smaller satellite elements. The horizon line should not divide the artwork in two equal parts, but be positioned to emphasize either the sky or ground, showing more sky if painting is of clouds, sunrise or sunset, and more ground if a landscape. These principles can be means of a good composition, yet they cannot be applied separately but should act together to form a good composition. Composition in photography is far from a science and is a result of all the rules mentioned above, which if applied effectively could create marvelous pictures. Yet, since photography is an art and a photographer is an artist, he or she can create magical effects with experimentation and creating new or unsaid rules, changing the dimension of photography. That's all we have for today. Thank you.